They say the gods are born in the heavens, but some are born in cages. Some are born in dirt and salt, their skin too soft for the violence that awaits them. Some are born not to reign, but to suffer, so that others may believe. And he was never meant to live long enough to choose, only to be chosen. The boy was not born with a name. Not really. His name was given like a sentence, not a gift. It was carved into him by men who believed in the sacredness of hierarchy, of blood, of silence. He was selected, not because he was wise, not because he was strong, but because he was pure. That strange, cruel word people use when they want something clean enough to destroy. He was beautiful, they said. Too beautiful. Skin pale like dawn behind the fog. Eyes wide, always watching. A voice barely used because speaking was not his place. He was the vessel, the offering, the bridge between flesh and the fire behind the stars. And so, when the drums began, deep, hollow, echoing across the stone courtyards like thunder in a hollow chest, he was taken, draped in silk, washed in oils, crowned in flowers that would wilt before the sun even set. They didn't tell him what would happen. They didn't have to. He had seen the other boys, the ones who smiled too much, the ones who asked too many questions, the ones who didn't return. He walked barefoot through the corridors of the gold and incense, between men in robes who pretended not to see the shaking of his legs. Women knelt as he passed, not in reverence, in sorrow, the kind of sorrow so old it had turned to ritual. He was placed upon a throne he did not want, told he was chosen by the gods, that his blood would open the gates, that his body would become sacred by being consumed. And even then, even at the edge of knowing, he still hoped they were wrong, still hoped there would be mercy. But mercy does not live where power makes myths of murder. They began with song, the kind that rises slow, like smoke from burning paper, voices layered in harmony too perfect to be human. The boy sat still, heart pounding loud enough to drown the melody. They placed a mask upon his face, gold, heavy, inhuman. It smiled for him. And then the priest stepped forward, not a man of rage, not a butcher, but a believer. He spoke of sacrifice, of ascension, of light buried in blood, and then he raised the blade, not jagged, not crude, a sacred thing, beautiful, ritualistic. The boy did not scream. He knew it would not save him. What he did instead, what no one expected, was stare directly at the priest, not with hatred, with pity. And in that moment, something broke, not in the blade, in the room, in the idea that this was destiny, because the boy, barely 12, barely breathing, had eyes not of fear but of understanding, as if he already knew that death was not the end, that he would become something more, not because they said so, but because pain that is witnessed, fully, truthfully, cannot die. The blade came down, and the song rose. They cut carefully, reverently, not to kill quickly, but to open him slowly, to offer each part of him to the gods who watched from behind smoke and fire. And piece by piece the boy was transformed, not into absence, into memory. The high priest lifted the heart, still warm, still pulsing, and the people cheered. But somewhere, in that terrible moment of celebration, someone looked away. Someone dropped their eyes, not from horror, but from shame, because deep inside they knew. This was not divinity. This was devouring. The boy died. Yes. His body gone. His name erased. But his gaze, that final, unspeakable look of pity, remained. It settled in the air like ash. It clung to the walls. It followed the priest in his dreams. And over time it became something more dangerous than any blade. Doubt. They tried to honor him, built temples, sang songs, told tales of his willing sacrifice, called him a bridge between heaven and earth. But no one believed it with the same fire anymore. Because a god that bleeds like a child is not a god that forgives. He did become a god, but not the kind they prayed to, the kind they feared, the kind that stares back when they close their eyes, and asks, was it worth it? They called it a sacrifice, but it was a feeding, not a meal of survival, a feast of meaning. Because in this world, people do not eat flesh to live, they eat it to believe. And what they believed in that night wasn't salvation, it was control. They took his body, not with hatred, not with haste, but with solemnity. His ribs were broken open like a gate, his organs placed on gold plates. And with every motion, every cut, every offering, the people whispered, "He is rising." But he did not rise. Not in spirit, not in fire, not in any way they could measure. He dissolved, And yet, the paradox was this. The more they destroyed him, the more powerful he became. Because stories begin where bodies end. And his story, it refused to vanish. At first they told it clean. The priests, the rulers, the mothers, they wrapped it in silk and incense and light. He was chosen, they said. He ascended, they insisted. He became divine by giving himself. But children don't give themselves. They are taken. And something inside the people knew that. So the tale began to twist. They said he didn't cry. Then they said he smiled. Then they said his blood turned into stars. That his breath in its final moment whispered a secret that only the high priest heard, and that the priest went mad trying to repeat it. The secret, they claimed, was holy. But what if it wasn't? What if the secret wasn't a prophecy? What if it was a question? Why are you doing this to me? That's the wound history had never healed. Because the boy had no sword, no kingdom, no voice. Only that look. That final shattering gaze of a child who understood more than those who claimed to speak for the gods. He had been dressed like a king, fed like a lamb, and broken like a truth the world couldn't accept. And now he was everywhere. Not in miracles, in doubt. Years passed. The temple grew rich. Festivals were held in his name. People painted his face in murals, carved his image into the stone of the Capitol. They imagined him seated in the stars, serene, forgiving, radiant. But the image never matched the memory. Because those who had been there, the elders, the keepers, the silent witnesses, remembered the trembling, the blood. The moment his hand reached up not in blessing, but in reflex. And they remembered the silence that fell when the heart stopped beating, a silence no choir could fill. It was said he died without a scream. That was a lie. He screamed, but not with sound, with presence. His absence was so vast, so sudden, so unnatural, that it screamed louder than thunder. It lived in the walls. It bloomed in the night air like a scent no one could name. And soon it began to rot the myth. At first the rot was slow, a missed ritual, a forgotten line in a sacred hymn, a priest who could no longer speak his name without swallowing twice. Then came the cracks. A woman refused to bow at his statue. A child asked why the god had been a boy and not a man. A foreigner arrived and said, "You eat your gods here?" and laughed. Laughed. That laugh, it echoed like heresy. But more dangerous than heresy is recognition. Because beneath the laughter was the unspoken truth. They didn't make him a god. They made him a ghost. And the people felt it. At night in dreams they saw him, not older, not changed. The same boy, always standing still at the edge of their visions, not smiling, not accusing, just there, watching. And watching is worse than haunting. Because when something haunts you, it wants something. But when it watches you, it waits for you to realize what you've done. The high priest began to lose his voice. Not all at once, word by word. He tried to give sermons, but the words dried in his throat. He tried to chant to the ancient prayers, but they turned to ash on his tongue. They said it was age. They said it was illness. But those who knew, truly knew, said it was the boy, still inside him, because he had touched the heart, held it aloft, declared it divine, and in doing so had broken the boundary between the sacred and the savage. One night the priest walked into the sea. He did not return, and they built no statue, because no statue can explain what it means to speak for a god, only to realize the god never asked you to speak. The temple tried to contain the damage. They revised the scriptures, softened the edges, made the boy a symbol, a star, a metaphor. But symbols don't stare. Stars don't bleed, and metaphors don't leave you waking in sweat, whispering apologies to no one. He was not metaphor. He was real. And that was the problem. Because when the divine is real, it doesn't ask for worship. It demands justice. And justice in this world is not built on gold or incense. It's built on memory. And the memory of the boy, naked, trembling, crowned against his will, became sharper with each passing generation. They tried to forget. They held festivals with louder drums, brighter lights, bigger lies. But he was still there, at the edge of the crowd, in the shadow of the temple walls, in the moment just before the knife is drawn. And the whisper remained, what if this wasn't godhood? What if this was murder with better lighting? And in that question, a new faith began to grow, quiet, hidden, among the mothers, among the children, among those who knew what it meant to be chosen, not because you were strong, but because you couldn't fight back. The boy had no army, but now he had witnesses. And that, more than gold, more than ritual, more than legacy, made him divine. Not in the way they meant, in the way they feared. The image of him remained, Impossibly young, impossibly still, a boy not growing, not fading, but fixated in eternal submission. His painted eyes stared from temple walls, from coins, from offerings carved in ivory and bone. They said he was radiant. They said he forgave. They said he asked for nothing. But nothing is a lie, because nothing always asks for something. And what he asked for now, centuries after his body had been consumed, was reckoning. No one dared admit it aloud, but even the priests had changed. They walked more slowly past his altar. Their prayers, once thunder, became careful arrangements of breath and fear. They feared saying the wrong thing, or perhaps finally the right thing, because there were rumors now, whispers, pilgrims who approached the statue and returned blind, a high priestess who collapsed during ritual with the boy's name frozen on her tongue, and then the dreams. All in the dreams. He was never cruel in them, just present, in a room with no walls, in a mirror that reflected nothing but his stare, in a forest where he knelt before you, not in prayer but in wait. He did not speak. He didn't have to. His very being was a question. What did you make of me? What do you worship, my light or your darkness? There was a temple keeper once, old and devoted. She cleaned his image daily, rubbed oil into the stone, changed the flowers at his feet. She had served the temple for 60 years, but one morning she was found in her chamber, eyes open, mouth smiling, hands clutched over her heart. On the wall above her bed, a single line was scratched in soot. He doesn't want this anymore. The council declared it heresy. They wiped the wall, repainted the ceiling, buried her without rite. But something had changed. Children began to flinch at the temple bells. Women started covering their children's ears during prayer. Farmers stopped planting on the holy calendar days. And the merchants, those who once sold carved statues of the boy's peaceful face, began quietly replacing them with animals, birds, even blank discs of clay. The silence was no longer sacred. It was loud. It followed everyone, because what they once celebrated as transcendence had begun to look like torment, not his, theirs. Because when a god is born from suffering, every act of devotion becomes a reenactment, and now the people began to feel it. Every drop of oil on his altar, blood. Every grain of rice offered, stolen breath. Every prayer, a whisper into the mouth of a boy who had never agreed to listen. They had not raised a god. They had trapped one. He had not died to become divine. He had died because they could not bear their own smallness. And now that divinity had turned back on them, not with punishment, but with reflection. One by one the faithful began to feel it. Not guilt, no. That would be too easy. What they felt was mirroring. The realization that what they saw in his image wasn't holiness. It was the part of themselves they had thrown into the fire and called sacred. It wasn't the boy they worshipped. It was what they were willing to kill in order to feel clean. And now that truth stared back from every shrine. One village far in the mountains decided to end it. They gathered and carried his statue to the edge of the cliffs. They said words. They wept. And then they pushed it into the sea. They thought it would free them. But that night, the tide brought back a child. Naked, unmarked, alive. They didn't know where he came from. He couldn't speak. But he walked straight to the altar, now empty, and sat. He didn't move. He didn't blink. And when the villagers tried to feed him, clothe him, name him, he simply watched. Within days, birds began circling the temple again. The winds changed. The old markings reappeared on the walls. And the village, once brave, once wild in its defiance, grew quiet. They boarded the temple. Then they fled, because they knew now. He was not a god born from choice. He was a god born of consequence. And consequence does not die. It waits. It waits until you forget. Until you rebuild. Until you carve his face in gold again. Until you name your sons after him. Until you kneel. And then it whispers, I remember. And in remembering he became powerful. Not because they believed. Because they couldn't escape. And so, he became more than a boy. He became the embodiment of the price no one wanted to name. The hunger behind holiness. The guilt behind purity. The sacrifice that didn't heal but hollowed. The God who was never asked, only offered. And now, in every city, there is a quiet fear, a coldness when the wind changes direction, a silence in temples too perfectly kept, a face, young, expressionless, familiar, painted on a wall that no one claims to have painted. He is not the God they hoped for. He is the God they deserve. The kingdom no longer remembered his name, not officially, not in records, not in the chants recited by trembling priests. It had been scrubbed from scrolls, softened in stories, buried under metaphor. But in the mouths of the desperate, in the dreams of children, in the silences between rituals, he was still there. And he had never been louder. At first, the temple tried to rename him. They gave him a gentler title, something celestial, abstract, untethered from blood, a god of transformation, a symbol of rebirth. They commissioned frescoes, no longer depicting his body, but an orb of light rising above the mountains. They rewrote hymns. No more mention of the altar, no more mention of sacrifice. But the people could feel it, under the marble, behind the paint, inside the incense. The rot remained, because the myth might change its clothes, but the bones stay buried in the same place. And bones, especially those taken too early, tend to rise. They began to appear, first in whispers, then in villages, then in cities. The hollow ones, women with shaved heads, men with sewn lips, children who refused to eat for weeks at a time. They wandered barefoot, robes dragging through mud and ash, eyes unfocused. They were not insane. They were possessed. But not by madness, by meaning. They carried nothing, owned nothing. But when they passed, people looked away, because their presence made the air feel thin. They claimed nothing, only that they had seen him. Not the statue, not the paintings. Him, a boy, in silence, in shadow, at the edge of the forest, at the edge of their dreams, sometimes crying, sometimes watching, sometimes simply Mandel walking away, barefoot, into nowhere. And those who saw him changed. They stopped eating meat. They stopped sleeping inside. Some plucked out their own eyes. They said, if he had no choice, neither do we. The state tried to suppress it. They called it blasphemy, a distortion, a dangerous cult. But how do you fight what has no name? How do you silence what lives in absence? They banned gatherings, arrested the hollow ones, but the jails could not hold them. They refused food, refused language, refused to even breathe like ordinary men. Some simply vanished. Others died smiling. And those who watched them die, guards, doctors, executioners, began to dream. They dreamed of the boy again, not dying this time, just standing there, waiting. And in that waiting, a terrible thought emerged. What if he was not a god because he was sacrificed? What if he was a god because he remembers everything? Every hand that held the blade, every tongue that chanted his name, every pair of eyes that watched him be stripped and painted and crowned and torn open. What if his divinity was not mercy, but memory sharpened into divinity? He never forgave. He never asked them to. He simply did not forget. And now no one else could. In one remote village where the last original temple still stood, a child was born with eyes black as ink. He never cried, never slept. He stared at corners as if listening. They named him a miracle, a return, a vessel. And the people rejoiced, briefly, until he spoke his first words. Don't do it again. They silenced him. He never spoke again, but he didn't have to. The village burned weeks later. No one found a body. Only a stone slab where the altar had once been, scorched but untouched at the center. And carved into its face, not by tools but by fire, was a sentence. You call it devotion. I call it hunger. The message spread, copied by hand, whispered across trade routes, painted in charcoal on the walls of Richmond's houses. The image of the boy returned, not soft, not glorious, but raw, bones visible beneath his skin, eyes open, even in death, a crown made of thorns, not gold, his body half-eaten, but his stare whole. And slowly, the people began to understand. This was not a God who wanted praise. This was a God who wanted you to look at yourself. Not the parts you show, the parts you hide, the parts you offer in secret, the parts you sacrifice, others, always others, to avoid, and those who looked too long saw it. The rituals weren't holy, they were hiding places. The incense wasn't cleansing, it was smoke to blur the truth. The temple wasn't a bridge to the divine, it was a cage to contain guilt. And the boy, he was not trapped inside. He was what remained after the trap was set, and now he was inside them, not as peace, as a slow burn behind the eyes, as the thought that doesn't leave, as the guilt that doesn't need proof. Because if you believe in a God that requires blood, eventually you'll give yours. And the boy, he waits for that moment, not to save you, but to watch, to see whether you will become what he was, or what he was meant to stop. Because the question is no longer who killed him, it's who keeps killing him. With every silence, with every ritual meant to forget, with every time we say it was for a greater good. There is no good great enough to eat a child, and still we keep setting the table, and still he watches, unblinking, The older the story grew, the more it decayed, and like all things that rot, it began to release a scent, not of death, but of truth. Something sour, something subtle, something that entered the nose before it entered the mind. The kind of truth that cannot be explained, only smelled, only felt. The kind of truth that makes your hands shake when you light a candle, though you don't know why. The rituals had become hollow by then. The temple still stood, still beautiful, still surrounded by courtyards and mirrors and shallow pools reflecting the sky like polished glass. But beneath that beauty, something had shifted. The prayers no longer reached the ceiling. The music no longer echoed. The silence no longer soothed. Because every sound was layered now. Everything meant something else. A priest lighting incense meant, I'm afraid. A girl in white robes meant, we still haven't learned. A sacrifice, no longer literal but symbolic, meant we've become more elegant at pretending. But the boy, he never changed. He remained, in paintings and statues and songs that tried to soften him, tried to frame him as willing, holy, calm. But he had never been calm, only still. And stillness, when forced, is a kind of scream, one so loud it makes silence feel safe by comparison. The Hollow Ones had retreated underground by this point, driven out of cities, labeled heretics, madmen, apostates, but even as the state hunted them, their numbers grew, not because of doctrine, not because of prophecy, but because the story refused to be buried. Every time the temple tried to erase him, the erasure itself became a message. Every forbidden question was an invitation. Every denied doubt became a sermon. And slowly, the people began to speak again. Not in crowds. In kitchens. In alleyways. In the dark. They whispered things too dangerous for daylight. What if he never wanted to be worshipped? What if the gods don't require blood at all? What if the boy is still here, watching who we choose to devour next? Because that was the unbearable part. This was never just about a child long dead. It was about the pattern, the repetition, the hunger that had taken a new shape but never disappeared. The sacrifice wasn't in the past. It was now. Every girl groomed for marriage before she had words for her body. Every servant who knew what not to say. Every son who cried in silence because strength was demanded of him. Every wound inherited. Every voice quieted. Every life deemed acceptable to lose for the sake of tradition, honor, family, faith. They were all pieces of the same altar. And he was no longer the boy on it. He was the one holding the mirror to it. And what people saw there was not divine. It was devouring dressed as duty. A few of the Hollow Ones emerged again, this time not to preach but to stand, silently, in the marketplace, in front of temples, outside city gates, their mouths sewn shut, their hands covered in ash, not moving, not blinking, just present. And when asked who they were, they wrote only one word, witness. Not believers, not victims, not martyrs, witnesses. Because the boy had never needed more blood. He needed eyes. He needed someone to look, truly look, at what had been done, at what was still being done, in his name, in the name of righteousness, in the name of love twisted into law. And that act, witnessing, became dangerous, because to witness is to break the spell, to say, that isn't sacred, that's a wound, to say, this isn't worship, this is repetition, to say, you're not following the boy, you're becoming the priest who opened his chest, and that, more than anything, shook the foundation of the kingdom. Because kingdoms survive on stories that protect their structure, on the myths that justify their cruelty, on silence that keeps the walls upright. And when someone begins to watch instead of obey, the whole thing begins to tilt. There is a high feast day approaching, the anniversary of the boy's ascension, a day once filled with candles and music and praise. But this year it was different. The temple was full, but the crowd was quiet. No songs, no speeches, no golden processions, only one act. A woman walked slowly down the aisle holding something in her arms, wrapped in linen, small, tender. The crowd stiffened. The guards didn't stop her. She approached the altar. The high priest opened his mouth, but no words came. The woman set the bundle down and unwrapped it. Inside was a mirror, simple, round, cracked. She turned it upward, so it faced the ceiling, the gods, the dome of painted light. Then she turned and walked away. No words, no explanation, but everyone understood. Because what was left there, at the center of the holy feast, was the most dangerous object a sacred place can hold, a reflection. And that was the beginning of the end. Not in fire, not in blood, in remembering. The temple never recovered. Some called it collapse, others called it rebirth. But the boy, he didn't care what they called it. He wasn't waiting for a name. He had always been waiting for them to stop feeding the myth and start facing the mirror. And that mirror was still there, on the altar, on every street, inside every one of them, waiting to be seen. He was never meant to be remembered. That was the mistake. He was meant to be consumed, ritually, symbolically, and finally completely. His bones broken, his name erased, his story polished into something soft enough to be repeated without discomfort. That was the plan. But there is something about a child's death, especially one wrapped in irreverence, that history cannot bury. Not truly. It festers beneath the foundations. It speaks through cracks in the walls. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't ask to be understood. It demands to be seen. In the end, it wasn't a war that ended the worship. It wasn't a rebellion or a fire or the collapse of the temple stones. It was a whisper, a slow, inevitable erosion of belief. Not from rage, from recognition. People no longer feared the boy. They feared what they saw in him, because he had stopped being a god a long time ago. He had become a question, and questions, especially the kind that sit at the center of you humming like a wound, cannot be sanctified. They cannot be buried in gold. They can only be answered, or endured. So when the temple finally fell, not by destruction, but by a neglect, no one mourned, not out loud, not in daylight, but in the quiet corners of the world, where the hollow ones still wandered, where mirrors were still covered, where prayers were whispered not to him but for him, a new ritual began. Not of worship, of reckoning. Children were told the real story, not the clean one, the cruel one, the human one, the version where a boy was taken, dressed in laces, and offered as a bridge to the divine, when in truth he had only ever been a mirror for the world's most shameful hunger, the desire to make something sacred by destroying it. And now, centuries later, people finally spoke the words that had gone unsaid. He didn't die for us. We killed him for ourselves. And that confession did something sacred. It let him go. Not forgotten. Freed. Because to be remembered as a god is still a prison. Still a story. Still a symbol. But to be remembered as a boy, a real boy, with breath and fear and blood and the terror of knowing what's coming and the inability to stop it, that is the beginning of truth. And truth, no matter how late, is the beginning of healing. So the final altar was not a temple. It was not made of stone. It was not lit with candles. It was not written in scripture. It was a field, an open field where once there had been fire and drums and ritual. Now there was only sky. And in the center of that sky, a single tree grew, tall, quiet, full of birds and wind, and the scent of something wild. No statues, no names, just the earth reclaiming what had once been stolen. People came now and then, some to cry, some to sit, some to say nothing at all. But none of them brought offerings. They brought only presents. Because if the boy had taught them anything, it was this. The divine does not ask for blood. It asks for honesty. It asks for witness. It asks to not be rewritten. And when the last of the hollow ones passed away, it was said she smiled, not because she believed in salvation, but because she had seen the truth survive the lie. She had lived long enough to know the difference. And in her final breath, she whispered the only prayer that had ever mattered. No more altars. No more crowns. Just eyes wide open and hands that do no harm. That was the end of the cult. That was the beginning of the myth dissolving into memory. And in that memory the boy lived, not as a god, as the part of all of us that wants to be seen without being devoured, that wants to be chosen without being used, that wants to be sacred without being sacrificed. He was never the bridge to heaven. He was the gate we burned to avoid walking through ourselves. And now that the smoke had cleared, he was still there, not in wrath, not in forgiveness, but in stillness. The same stillness he held the moment before the blade. The stillness of someone who knew, better than any priest, what the cost of being worshipped really was. The boy became a god. But he did not ascend. He remained, not to rule, not to punish, just to remind that every time we dress violence in ritual, every time we call a child's death divine, every time we silence a scream with song, he will be there, waiting, watching, unchanged.